The only reason this shows that he doesn't care about science is if you assume the so-called scientific view that resurrections can't happen. And so if you already know that resurrections can't happen because science doesn't show that they happen, well, then you could say this guy doesn't care about science. But notice what you have to assume first before it's even worthwhile in the discussion. You have to assume the very thing they're debating. The very thing they're debating is whether God exists and therefore makes miracles possible. Christopher Hitchens assumes his point of view to attack J. Richards. This in thinking is called circular reasoning. Now, I might have moved a little fast past you on that one, but it's a blunder of very foundational, fundamental issues in thinking that Christopher Hitchens makes in front of everybody, and I bet you 90% of the people didn't catch it because they don't know what that looks like. Let me give you one other example. The point that I'm making here is here's Mr. Hitchens that's taking the rational high road that ends up making a very simple blunder in thinking, and he thinks that he has refuted J. Richards. Richard Dawkins is a very famous atheist, probably the number one apologist for evolution since Stephen Jay Gould, the American Harvard paleontologist, died a few years back. And he is very, very hostile towards Christian. His book is The God Delusion. And as you're reading through his book, you might try to make sense of his argument, like put it out and figure out what it is, clear the brush and get the argument there. But he doesn't want you to be confused about what his argument is. So on page 187 of his book, he lays it out in 6 different points. So can we put that up there too? And here's Dawkins' argument. Now, by the way, this is from the text. This is not my summary of his argument. This is his argument. He says, I don't want you to mistake what I'm trying to prove here, so let me give it to you step by step. Now, what is an argument? An argument is a conclusion or a point of view that is buttressed by a series of statements that represent evidence to lead you to the conclusion. All right? That's how reason works. Notice in the bottom, the therefore. Therefore, God almost certainly does not exist. So all of these points are supposed to lead to that final conclusion. Now remember, this is Richard Dawkins, the most famous evolutionist in the world, the person who said that Darwin gave atheism intellectual integrity, basically. So let's look at his argument. Point 1. One of the greatest challenges to the human intellect has been to explain how the complex, improbable appearance of design in the universe arises. Well, he's right about that. Does that statement advance his argument at all? Does that statement have anything to do with the conclusion? No, it's an introductory statement. It's not evidence for his view. He's just kind of warming you up. Okay, so let's strike that one because it's not part of the argument. Do you see what I'm talking about here? He just said this is an important issue. Right, okay, let's look at the next one. The natural temptation is to attribute the appearance of design to actual design itself. Now, is that true, do you think? If you look at something that looks designed, like the order of the chairs in this room, wouldn't it be natural to attribute that to a designer? Sure. By the way, does that advance his particular argument? No, it has nothing to do with his argument. So let's strike that one. Move down a couple of points. He says, we do not have a naturalistic explanation. I'm giving you a little more information here because we jumped down, but we don't have, with regards to the laws of physics, etc., and what we discover in physics that look like design, we don't have a naturalistic argument available to us like we do for Darwinian evolution. So he's going to argue that we have an explanation for what appears to be design in biology, and that's Darwinism. Now, we don't have any evidence for that in physics, but we should not give up the hope of a better explanation arising in physics, something as powerful as Darwinism for biology. So these two statements are, one, we don't have evidence to explain design in physics, and maybe we'll get some evidence to explain design in physics. Now, do either of those statements advance his argument or support his argument that God certainly doesn't exist? No, not at all. So these are irrelevant features of his argument. So let's strike all of that stuff that really turns out just to be interesting. Words, but don't advance the argument. Let's trim it down in the next slide to what we actually have left. Here is what we have in Dawkins' argument. The temptation to infer a designer is a false one because the designer hypothesis immediately raises the larger problem of who raised a designer. Now, he's already said that if you look at design, what appears to be design, it's natural to think, well, that's a designer. But he says that's not a good way to think about it because I could always ask you, all right, who designed the designer? Now, the most ingenious and powerful explanation is Darwinian evolution by natural selection. Therefore, God almost certainly does not exist. Now, I want you to see something. Some of you have already seen it because I can hear you chuckling, and I don't mean to be abusive to Mr. Dawkins, but these are his words. Do you see that the two remaining statements that are relevant to the argument itself, that is arriving at the conclusion, even if I granted that both of them were true, does not lead me to the conclusion that God, therefore, almost certainly does not exist?